This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. What does the current wave of populism in America mean, and how did we get here? Sam Tanenhaus, former editor of the Book Review and host of this podcast, is here to talk about what recent political books tell us about this current, very strange political moment.
So if Trump can come along and speak about different ethnic groups in a way that captures some of that language of anxiety, well, people in Alabama are going to vote for him, whether he can recite verses accurately from the Bible or not.
Writing about race as a young reporter in the South in the early 60s gave Calvin Trillin and his readers in The New Yorker an early look at the civil rights movement. He joins us now to talk about his new book, Jackson, 1964.
We've made some progress, but it's sort of disappointing to see how some of these stories could be written today.
Also, the latest literary news, your summer reading memories, and the books we and other people are reading. Someone very familiar to all our listeners joins us now, Sam Tanenhaus. Sam, thank you for being here.
Always a pleasure, Pamela.
So we asked you to do something for this issue that was very wide open. Sent you, I don't know, how many books did we send you? About 30 books?
Not quite that many, though at times it seemed so.
Yes. And asked you this question, which was, why populism now? Is there anything that all the political books coming out right now can tell us about this crazy moment in contemporary politics? Did you find the answer?
Well, what I found, Pamela, is having written a book myself a couple of election cycles ago, a little bit like some of these, is it's really hard to write a book in the moment that captures the moment. Either you get out in front, you see things going on that don't make sense at the time, and then readers come around later and say, oh, well, maybe he or she was right about that. But look at all the other things they got wrong. Or you're behind. And I think that's what happened this time is the politics itself was so surprising.
Yeah.
Books written a year before or 6 months before do something else for us. What they do is give us a snapshot of how things looked then. Okay, so you think, well, what good is that? Well, that's where we all were. By all of us, I mean Americans. So when we think back to where we were and then we look to where we got, these books become little signposts along the way,
right,
if that makes any sense.
Right. You have 8 books that you write about in this essay. Right now, these books are all kind of published within this last 3-month period. Each of them had their genesis at least a year ago, before Trump even declared himself a candidate.
And you see some interesting things happen along the way. One of the books that I review, I think it's Going Red, refers to Trump in the past tense. It describes how he had been doing well early on. That's a book by Ed Morrissey that is really a blueprint for the Republican Party based on something listeners will have heard referred to as the autopsy report, the Republican autopsy. That was the famous soul-searching document the Republican National Committee wrote and distributed after their loss in 2012, and they're trying to figure out what to do. So Ed Morrissey, who's a blogger and a close political observer, traveled to these battleground counties in different states and talked to people, Republicans or potential Republican voters in places the party hadn't been looking at. African Americans, Latinos, millennials, to try to find out what the party might do to attract them.
I mean, the subtitle here to Going Red, Ed Morrissey's book, is The 2 Million Voters Who Will Elect the Next President and How Conservatives Can Win Them. I mean, who is he saying those 2 million voters were?
Well, we assume they were moderates, independents, undecideds, all the people who weren't voting for Republicans but were not necessarily devoted or lifelong Democrats, the people in the middle who most of the time seem to decide elections.
And it's funny because, I mean, Romney and going back to Dole and even, George W. Bush with the Compassionate Conservatives, these were all candidates that were kind of like the consensus candidates, the establishment candidates and the safer candidates who they thought could reach out to those middle ground voters. But it turns out that so far with Trump that's not at all, at least in the primary, what they need in order to win.
And it's exactly also, Pamela, if you think about it, what almost happened with the Democrats. Because Bernie Sanders, who was really supposed to be or seemed to be the kind of off-the-bench substitute, the poor person substitute for Elizabeth Warren, she was the populist that people were clamoring for. Your excellent colleague and formerly mine when I was at the Times, Jonathan Martin, did a story 2 years ago or more saying Elizabeth Warren is the new face of economic populism, which will dominate the Democratic Party. As far as it went, he was right in the big idea. Bernie Sanders came out of nowhere to capture that vote. So one of the points I make in the essay is the real division in our politics is not so much right now between left and right or even between the two parties. It's between the people at the top, the idea people, the establishment people, the party officials and insiders, the think tanks, the op-ed columnists, the elite, and the voters below.
Right.
And the voters just aren't that interested in what the elites have to tell them. So my essay begins with one of our greatest modern historians, Arthur Schlesinger, describing the election of 1936 in language that could come right out of today.
What did he say?
What he says is the country was doing a little better after the Great Depression. So you draw the analogy. Well, we're doing better after the Great Recession. But the progress was slow.
And unequal.
Unequal. And who's being left out? Well, we know that the poor are almost always left out. And those who don't have the social connections, those who were somewhat marginal in the culture. But there's also another big group that always gets overlooked in elections. And those are what he called members of old America, capital O, capital A. They're the ones who are voting for Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders now in many cases. They're often white, they're working class, or in the horrible old term, lower middle class, people who are struggling, who have felt their place in the society, in its institutions, and in the culture, on television and film, the books that get written and read, that it's pushing them aside a little bit. And here I'd like to say one thing I admired in all the books I wrote about, even though some books seemed to me far better than others, is that they were about voters. They were not about candidates. They were not about strategists. They were not about donors and fundraisers, except to criticize them.
Right.
And that's another thing we learned this election, that the billionaires don't decide everything. The donor class doesn't get to make all the calls.
Right. You have two candidates. Trump didn't fundraise at all for quite some time, and Bernie Sanders was fundraising from, in very small amounts from, individual donors.
$27, you always said. Also, they both denounced the so-called donor class, and voters responded to it. So paradoxically, books that are about the power of the donor class got something right, which is that they seem to be occupying too big a position. Voters came along, agreed with the authors of those books in essence, and repudiated it. Therefore, a book like the one on the big money that goes into the Tea Party on tobacco.
Poison Tea, How Big Oil and Big Tobacco Invented the Tea Party and Captured the GOP by Jeff Nesbitt. That sounds probably not entirely persuasive, at least when it comes to what's going on with this
Well,
election.
exactly. That was how things looked when he wrote that book. And yet, one of the important contributions he makes is to say that powerful figures like the Koch brothers don't really concentrate all their fire or all their resources on the presidency. That important laws get made at the local and state level, and that really governs how we, normal people, are living much of the time. He has a good chapter, for instance, on how an anti-smoking ban was defeated in Minnesota through a series of libertarian arguments. So his book is useful because it shows you how big a concern that seemed at the time, the power of tobacco and other lobbies, donors like the Kochs. At the same time that it reminds you, well, just because this presidential election has repudiated those figures and those forces, it doesn't mean they won't resurface in other areas in our political life.
Let's talk about another book that comes from the perspective of the right, The Way Back, Restoring the Promise of America by F.H. Buckley. Of course, I have to ask, that's no relation to William F. Buckley.
I don't think he is, but there are many Buckleys and there are all sorts of connections. F.H. Buckley is actually kind of a brilliant guy, I found. He is extremely erudite and learned. He's a law professor at George Mason University, I believe. And he can do things like regression analysis. He has all these tables and charts. But his argument seemed to me to be written from so high a plane, so removed from where voters actually are, that in a way it captures in microcosm the problem the Republican establishment made, which is to see voters through almost the wrong end of the telescope. So he writes, Buckley does, with utter mystification that African Americans should be united behind opposing filibusters in the Senate, favoring filibuster reform. He said, why would they do this when it doesn't help them as a group? A classic instance, by the way, of how conservatives suddenly develop the identity politics they say they hate when it seems to work in their favor at argument time. Well, the answer, Professor Buckley, is that any African American knows the filibuster was the weapon used to perpetuate the brutalization and second-class citizenship of African Americans since the beginning of Reconstruction. So of course they're going to agree that the filibuster should be reformed. So I'm thinking, how can he not know this? Well, because what he knows is the mathematics that he does and the charts and the tables. He's not looking at what voters themselves think and want. Same thing happens when he writes about white voters. He seems to describe the voters we now understand to be Trump voters as this kind of distant species of people who are living these abject, awful lives. There's no connection between an intellectual on the right and the people they're looking to for their support. Well, what happened in the primaries? Precisely
Trump.
That.
Was there any book in here that you would say was especially insightful or persuasive?
There is a book called The End of White Christian America by Robert P. Jones, who is the CEO of a religion think tank institute. It's not about dogma or doctrine. It seems to be non-denominational and to go across all sorts of religions, in fact. But what he's done in a non-political way is to look very closely at declining membership and enthusiasm among the group we think of as being most dominant in America, white Protestants, particularly evangelicals. And he looks at polls, he looks at surveys. The percentage of evangelicals in the society at large has really dropped off a cliff in about the past 10 years. The division between more mainstream, mainline Protestant denominations like Episcopalians and Presbyterians, the division between them and the evangelicals gets wider and wider. And I thought he did one particularly helpful sequence of narratives where he does not argue so much as show you where the numbers lead. And I thought he was sympathetic to all sides. He has a chapter on how way back when, in the 1950s and 60s, when the civil rights movement was growing up in the South, some of its most fierce opponents were in churches, which we don't think of because we think of
in white churches.
In white churches, because we think of the solidarity between figures like the Reverend Billy Graham and Martin Luther King. Well, first of all, much of that has been exaggerated, as I think people who study the history know. I've written a lot about, or researched a lot about religion and race in the South for the biography I'm writing of Bill Buckley because his family was essentially a Southern family. There was a lot of opposition and hostility to desegregation made in the same kinds of language we now hear about transgender people and same-sex marriage. That this is going to pollute our values, that the races have to be kept apart. What in the essay I call, I think, ungodly carnal mixing, whether it's same-sex or different races.
Right.
Well, when you look at that, and Jones does not do it polemically. He just says, here are some of the things that happen. Well, what happens in your mind is you realize, well, Donald Trump, who's actually, you can't see my air quotes here, actually pretty good on things like gender, is not so good when it...
I have to laugh. I'm sorry,
Well,
even with the scare quotes.
Well, what I mean about gender is I really mean things like bathrooms, transgender issues, and all that. How he talks about women and what women think of him is a whole other issue. But on these kind of cultural issues, he's actually not that involved in them. They don't seem that important to him. And you look at someone like Ted Cruz, and that's what all his campaign was really about. If you remember, his last-ditch campaign in Indiana was about the bathrooms, I think.
Right.
Well, what Jones makes you see is there's a link between these things. So if Trump can come along and speak about different ethnic groups in a way that captures some of that language of anxiety, well, people in Alabama are going to vote for him, whether he can recite verses accurately from the Bible or not.
How well do these books, do any of them really address the economic insecurity and the fears that people have that are drawing them to candidates like Trump and Sanders?
Pamela, when you have their People Get Ready, which is very much from the left, by Robert McChesney and John Nichols, they write very much from the perspective of The Nation magazine.
This is a Nation book. It comes from the magazine.
And they have a blurb on the front from Noam Chomsky.
And a blurb from Bernie Sanders on the back.
Well, yes, this is, I would say, a Bernie Sanders book. If you want to understand Bernie Sanders, with one omission, they don't write about Jesse Jackson, who is the most underrated modern politician. He's the creator of the contemporary Democratic Party, and he should be in this book. But what they do is walk you through what we think of as the Democratic left, which is really the New Deal, Henry Wallace, not George Wallace, Henry Wallace's Progressive Party platform in 1948, George McGovern's in 1972. What's it about? It's about guaranteeing people incomes. It's giving them jobs. It's universal health care. Why is that important? Because those are the issues that speak to the heroes of another book I reviewed called Raising the Floor by Andy Stern. And what he writes about is really millennials. Everybody wants the millennial vote. It's the largest population cohort. You know this very well. You're a professional demographer. The numbers are huge. There are far more of them than there are baby boomers. In fact, they're baby boomers' children, like my daughter. They are very much on the left. They want a government that helps them. And more than 40% of them identify as not being white. That's the group everybody wants. That's what the autopsy report the Republicans published all those years ago was about, getting millennials, okay?
And his argument is that a universal basic income.
Yes, he's in favor of a universal basic income. And I did some research on that and found that brilliant younger journalists like Ezra Klein at Vox are all big supporters of the universal basic income. Give people money and let them decide how to spend it. Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Richard Nixon had the same idea in 1969. It was called the Family Assistance Plan, negative income tax. If people don't have money, the government has money. Instead of devising 1,000 programs that may not work, why not just trust people's intelligence and instincts?
So there is a rational libertarian reason for that.
Yes, there is. Now, would it have worked? Who knows? The interesting thing, by the way, to get very wonky here, is that although that idea failed of the universal basic income way back when, it's what later became the earned income tax credit, which people of lower incomes really do benefit from. Right. One of the interesting things in Andy Stern's book is he makes you see how optimistic millennials are. That on the one hand, there are no jobs for them. There's almost no place for them to go. They're working at jobs, if they get them, that are below their capacities, their education and learning. But they also believe in the entrepreneurial spirit that came out of Silicon Valley, that kind of came out of the Reagan and Bill Clinton era. So they really think there's a future for them. So the surprise in Raising the Floor is how much hope these younger voters have. That's one of the things they actually seem to like about Sanders is even though his promises are so extravagant, they appeal to this hopeful side of people that thinks, well, maybe we could do all these things. David Cole, the author of Engines of Liberty, The Power of Citizen Activists to Make Constitutional Law, may be the most optimistic book in the group because he reminds you of things you don't think about.
He must have started it like 10 years ago.
Well, once you read through some of his arguments, you realize that what he writes about is how citizen activists have been responsible for some of the biggest changes in our lives as a community. Look at something like same-sex marriage. The reason the Supreme Court finally validated it, overturned the Defense of Marriage Act and that Proposition 8 in California, was not so much because the law proved that people are constitutionally guaranteed to marry whomever they like. In fact, John Roberts, in his dissent, said, no, this has nothing to do with the Constitution. David Cole effectively argues, so what? That what it's really about is how a huge movement was created that captured the imagination of the public so that individuals began to think, why shouldn't people be able to marry whomever they want? And what's so radical about marriage anyway? It's actually a very conservative impulse. So what he does is make you realize again, well, that's what happened with the civil rights movement. There was no constitutional guarantee that you get to go to the same school as somebody else. But it seemed wrong that people were being kept from it, and the country came around to that point of view. He reminds you that politics works incrementally, which we forget when we see these huge bombastic candidates getting these incredible results and everything seems to be overturned overnight, that behind them are these small incremental changes. And that's what these books collectively kind of make you see. If you look in one little area, a bell will ring and think, oh, yes, I do remember that from 2008 or 2010. And that is a little bit like what we're seeing now. And that's what books can do for us.
Explaining it all. Sam Tanenhaus, thank you so much.
Always great to talk to you, Pamela.
Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk about what's going on in the book world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So your favorite topic this week is?
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump.
We're all interested in him, right?
All right.
So
book publishers hope so, right?
Absolutely. I mean, in an election year, there's always a lot of political books coming out, but I think it's an exceptionally large crop this year. There's so much interest in Donald Trump, and there's, various categories of books coming out, including re-releases of books that were published in the 90s that people are updating. There's several parodies coming out, a kind of spoof children's book, and then some serious investigative work that's being kind of crashed for the election. So some of the stuff that's coming up soon includes Mark Singer's book, Trump and Me. That's coming out on July 5th. He's a New Yorker writer, of course, and he profiled Donald Trump in 1996. Donald Trump did not appreciate the profile and wrote him some angry letters. In fact, that is the blurb on the book. It says, Mark, you are a total loser and your book and writing suck, Donald Trump. He's repackaged the profile, but he's also written a new introduction kind of about what we've learned since about Donald Trump and what his candidacy means for the country. That's coming out from Tim Dugan Books. Another book that is in the works that's kind of being repackaged is Lost Tycoon by the journalist Harry Hurt, and that was released in 1993 by Norton. And Donald Trump did not appreciate that either. He threatened to sue them, but the lawsuit didn't go forward. Harry Hurt is re-releasing this book now with Echo Point Press.
What else?
So then in terms of the new books that are being kind of crashed, and these are on very accelerated publishing schedules considering that publishers usually are looking years out, those include a book called The Making of Donald Trump by David K. Johnston.
He's of course, a former Times person.
Yes, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter. He's worked here, and that book is being published by Melville House on August 2nd.
And did he report on Donald Trump?
He did. He reported on him for a long time in looking into his real estate dealings and other things. And similarly, also in August, Scribner is publishing Trump Revealed, which is a book that is being reported by a team of Washington Post journalists, and it's co-authored by the political reporter Michael Kranish and senior editor Mark Fisher.
So here's a funny thing. The other day on Twitter, Carlos Losada, who is at the Washington Post and is the nonfiction reviewer there, he used to be the editor of their Outlook section, he noted in a tweet to me that the blurb on Donald Trump's own book, Art of the Deal, is this: he makes one believe in the American dream again, quote unquote, the New York Times. So he said, really? Where did that appear? So I looked it up, and the full quote came from a review in the New York Times in the daily section, Arts, by Christopher Lehman-Hout, former critic for the New York Times. The full quote was, Mr. Trump makes one believe for a moment in the American dream again. It's like a fairy tale.
Oh,
so there are some interesting,
rather different. A little bit of context was stripped
so
away.
Blurb editing lessons. That's how it's done.
That's very funny. So actually, there's a few kind of humor books coming out, too, as one would expect. There's a thriller parody called The Day of the Donald by Andrew Schaefer, and that takes place, this is, of course, fiction, 2 years into a Donald Trump presidency. A large wall has been built along the Mexican border, and various other shenanigans are taking place. And there's a child's first book of Trump by the comedian Michael Ian Black, which is coming out. And is
my children actually
funny.
already very much like that book.
Yes, it's kind of got a rollicking rhyme scheme to it. So.
And we should point out it's illustrated by Mark Rosenthal, who is a completely brilliant children's book illustrator and editorial illustrator, occasionally for the Times, too.
And one last important category, of course, coloring books are important for relaxing, and there's several choices of Trump coloring books that people can pick up if all this politics is making them feel anxious.
I think there's also paper dolls.
Yes, there are paper dolls if you want to role play.
But what we really need is color by number. Where's that?
Where is that? There's got to be one.
All right. Attention, publishers. Okay. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Calvin Trillin joins us now. His latest book is called Jackson, 1964, and Other Dispatches from 50 Years of Reporting on Race. Calvin, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So what inspired you to put together this collection now?
Well, it's actually not a what, it's a he. I, for the last several years, have been visiting a history class at NYU, and the professor, Robert Cohen, suggested that some of the pieces on race could be a collection. So then I thought about it, and there it was.
What's the history class?
History was a class was on civil rights,
mm-hmm.
and he by chance used to teach at the University of Georgia, so he was quite familiar with some of the things I'd done.
And he had you in there to sort of talk about the experience reporting and what you'd seen.
Yeah. Exactly. It wasn't a journalism class, it was a history class, so about some of the things I'd seen. And I think one time, because Charlene Hunter, who was one of the first two black undergraduates at the University of Georgia, was in town, so I brought her with me. And so it was sort of recalling what had happened.
Did the students really appreciate, I imagine, that sort of firsthand account?
Yeah, I think they really appreciated seeing Charlene.
And they were okay with having you there, too.
They were okay with it. As long as I brought her, I was okay.
Had it been a long time since you'd gone back to those early reported pieces?
Yes. A lot of them were from a period from about 68 to 82, something like that, when I did a piece for The New Yorker every 3 weeks from somewhere around the country. So I was sort of on to the next piece. And I have usually found that trying to go back and bring a piece up to date with another piece is often unsuccessful because some people haven't read the first piece, and so I never really followed up on any of them. So when I started doing the postscripts for this book, I realized a lot of the information was totally new to me. I had no idea how things had turned out.
So you you looked at the issues you reported on and did a postscript bringing the issue up to date.
Yes. For instance, there's a piece on the Denver school, attempt to integrate the Denver schools, and
That was in 1969?
yeah, something like that. So I did a postscript on where it stood now and where school integration stands now.
Let's talk a little bit about that. So what was going on in Denver in the schools at that time?
Well, there was an attempt to integrate the schools through busing and change of zones. And it turned out that the white people in Denver were so much against it that even the neighborhoods that would have been, by their terms, better off, that is more stabilized, were against it. And Denver eventually was the first case brought by the Civil Rights Division to try to integrate the schools. And basically, it didn't work. There was white. And school integration in general, I think Nicole Hannah-Jones has done a lot of work on that for the New York Times Magazine and also for This American Life.
Yeah, and it was just announced, actually, that she's writing a book now for
I'm glad to hear that.
Chris Jackson about.
She did some very solid reporting. And I think she found that the actual integration of the schools peaked in 1988. And that also had statistics showing that the progress in cutting the gap between, say, reading scores and math scores between poor kids of color and privileged kids, that's the only time it fell, between 71 when desegregation really got started and 1988. So her contention or her reporting would indicate that it's actually the only thing that really worked. But, of course, it's now fading away.
And what's it like now in Denver?
The schools are majority Latino now. And a lot of the white kids are in the suburbs.
So did you go back to Denver and
No.
sort of re-report? Or
No,
just kind of...
I couldn't go back to each place. Thank God for the Internet.
Yes.
And by phone, I did a lot of reporting.
Was there one place that you really, if it had been practical, would have wanted to go back and actually sort of re-report and really get a sense of what's going on there now?
Yeah, I think maybe when Victoria DeLee is a woman who I did pieces in the book, and it's kind of an oral history. It's in her own words. I found her so interesting, and the place interesting, kind of rural South Carolina. I found it interesting when I went back and read the piece for the first time in a long time. This was not that long after the Charleston shooting, and Victoria DeLee had said she was so mad at white people when she brought up she wanted to kill them up. She said, and then she, through her church, I think, and her religion, decided that she had to forgive them, not take any guff from them, but forgive them. And when you read that, and that piece was done in the 60s probably, it sort of echoed what the Charleston families said after their people were killed in a church that they forgave.
I mean, I imagine when you go back to old reporting on a number of subjects, you think like, wow, well, that was an old time and place that doesn't exist anymore. But it sounds like with this collection, the opposite is kind of true.
I think there's evidence in both directions. I mentioned in the introduction that at the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides, at one of the commemorative events, someone said to me, who would have thought when we were in Mississippi in 1961 that we'd have a black president? And I said, when we were in Mississippi in 1961, I would have settled for a black policeman. Things looked so different. On the other hand, you could show some progress in Jackson, Mississippi, when they had the commemoration of the Freedom Rides there. Both the mayor and the police chief were black. So there's you can't say there hasn't been progress, but on the other hand, if you look at some of the statistics and some of the what's happened in the schools and these new laws that are basically a way to disenfranchise people, this time by photo IDs rather than by billy clubs, I'm not so sure you could say that a lot of progress has been made.
Going back to that original piece in this collection, Jackson, 1964, how did you end up there? Who were you writing for?
I was writing for the New Yorker. All of these pieces are from the New Yorker. I had come to the New Yorker basically to do a story that's not in the book because it's too long. It's a book in itself. It was called An Education in Georgia, about the desegregation of the University of Georgia. And I had spent a year in the South in the Time Bureau at that time. I can't remember whether William Shawn suggested that I might want to go to Jackson.
Then the editor of the New Yorker.
Then the editor of the New Yorker. He rarely said, go do this. I mean, or never in my case did he say, would like for you to do this, but he sort of occasionally made suggestions. I was the person who had spent the most time in that sort of situation. So it was sort of the story of the moment, the Mississippi Freedom Summer.
What was it like reading it again, going back and rereading that piece that you wrote?
Well, I realized that at that time, it was almost like being in a different country. And in fact, I mentioned that I used to say to my office when I went to file my story from Memphis or from New Orleans, I've slipped over the border. I'm out of there. Although it wasn't the most dangerous place. I think Alabama, most reporters thought was more dangerous.
For reporters.
For reporters. I think they were equally dangerous for black people, particularly black people trying to do something like vote or go to a library or something like that. But then when I went back, there's a piece in there about the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, and I was using the library at the Mississippi Southern. It seemed hard to believe really when I went back and read that State Sovereignty Commission piece, that the State Sovereignty Commission of Mississippi, which I describe as a sort of a corn-pone Stasi, would actually investigate the possibility that a woman in a small town in Mississippi had a baby who was partly black, that the inspector, the man working for the State Sovereignty Commission, would inspect the baby along with the local sheriff, couldn't decide, started looking at the baby's fingernails. There was a legend when I grew up in Missouri that you could tell if people had what we said black blood by whether they had little half moons on the cuticles, their fingernails. I can't remember whether you're supposed to have them or not have them to be black.
Right, because they didn't have horns like the Jews.
Yeah, that's right. We were only 6 or 7 years old. It was at a time when we also thought the Japanese had yellow blood.
Right.
These were grown-ups.
Yeah.
And finally, the woman, I think sensing an opportunity, said the father was Italian. So to them it was something in between, not quite as bad.
Right. Probably still suspect. What strikes me when you go back and you read stories from that time period, whether in Time magazine or elsewhere, is the way that the sentiments haven't necessarily totally changed, but people were so much less self-conscious about what they would actually say on the record.
That's right. I used to be able to tell how people stood on race issues by the way they pronounced Negro, or if they used the word Negro.
Right.
And yes, people were much more open. The other thing that struck me reading some of these pieces is how corrupting that whole segregation, basically apartheid, was for white people as well as black people. In the University of Georgia desegregation case, after you could no longer claim various reasons for not integrating, you pretty much had to show that there wasn't any segregation. The University of Georgia president was asked by the state's own lawyer, have these two students been treated like every other applicant? He said yes. I mean, he publicly perjured himself. And when you think about people reporting their neighbors and things, white people They didn't have the kind of day-to-day humiliation and suffering that black people had, but it was unhealthy for them as well.
Americans are not known for their grasp of history. If there's one thing that you would want readers who didn't live through this experience to come away with reading this book as it relates to race relations today, what would that be?
I would say that we've made some progress, but it's sort of disappointing to see how some of these stories could be written today.
Well, I think it's good for everyone to go back and reread these or read them for the first time. So the book, again, is Jackson, 1964, and Other Dispatches from 50 Years of Reporting on Race in America by Calvin Trillin. Bud, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right, John Williams joins us now with a fun participatory moment at the Book Review podcast.
Hey,
Hi, John.
How are you?
I'm good. So you are going to represent from the people who have sent us their voice memos. Can you explain exactly the technicalities?
The technicality is to send us a 30-second voice memo on your smartphone about a memorable summer reading experience you had, and that could be any time from when you were a little child to last summer, and tell us why it was so memorable. And we've been hearing from a lot of you, and last week we listened to a few, and this week we'll listen to a few more.
Okay, so quickly, though, they don't send it to John.
Well,
where do they send it?
They send it to podcast@nytimes.com.
All right, send them to podcasts@nytimes.com. Let's hear a few.
This is Stacy Fuller, and I live in New York City. The summer read that will always stick in my mind is when I read Memoirs of a Geisha in July of '99. I had graduated from college that May from the University of Nebraska, and I got offered a job in Chicago. So I picked up sticks and I moved all by myself to a city where I really didn't know anyone. And I moved into the basement apartment of this lovely older gay couple that I had found via the Chicago Reader Classifieds. And it was exciting, but it was also the scariest time. It was the loneliest I'd ever been in my life. And that book was able to give me such solace at just this scary and exhilarating time.
You know what I love about these memos is that everyone not only talks about the book, but they talk about the place.
Yeah, and that's really what we wanted to hear, and it's really exhilarating, kind of.
All right, let's hear another.
This is Paul Foley calling from Watertown, Massachusetts. One of my more memorable summer reading experiences goes back more than 50 years ago to the summer of 1963. I was 12 years old, and I borrowed from my brother a paperback copy of The Catcher in the Rye, which I brought with me to the beach, Good Harbor Beach. I remember reading this book under a green and yellow striped umbrella. I had never read a book that spoke to me so directly, in a voice so immediate, so familiar, and so true. For me, this book was a revelation.
Did you read Catcher in the Rye?
I did. I read Catcher in the Rye probably around the time that Paul did, and I enjoyed it. But I can't say that it was the most mind-blowing reading experience of my youth.
I hated it. It's my secret. I've just revealed.
Not so secret anymore.
Not anymore. All right, let's hear one more.
Hi, my name is Lindy Bulio, and I live in a suburb of Chicago. And my memorable summer reading took place in 1997 in Brussels. I was reading In Search of Lost Time, had a lot of downtime, and was able to completely immerse myself in that series of books. It became my favorite fiction of all time. And the remarkable thing was the way that the characters and places of that book completely dominated my life and were more significant and real to me than actually the place and the time and the people that I was living and working amongst.
What I find really interesting about these is, first, how many people's experiences happened abroad. And secondly, I'm as bad as anybody in terms of losing myself in a book, even when I'm somewhere special where I shouldn't be. But I just feel like, even with Proust, put Proust down and go hang out in Brussels. I just feel bad that us readers, we get so absorbed that we don't really live the lives that are going on around us.
I know. We're too busy reading about other people's lives.
We are. Here's another last one.
My name is Paul Schindler, and I live in Orinda, California. My memorable summer book was Robert Heinlein's Have Spacesuit Will Travel. In the summer of '66, I was 14 and working my way through the science fiction section of the library. Have Spacesuit captured my imagination with its depiction of engineering ingenuity by a high school senior. At the end of the book, the protagonist is offered a scholarship to MIT, and that was when I vowed to attend MIT myself, which 4 years later, I did.
I was not, as a young person, a big sci-fi reader, so I can't relate as much to that one, but I love the fact that he ended up going to MIT. We are urging people to send us voice memos, but we have said that if you absolutely cannot figure out the voice memo technology, you can also write to us at podcast@nytimes.com, and that is what Linda Essler from Bloomfield, New Jersey did. So I'm going to read Linda's email. Linda writes, "The summer before I turned 12, I went to sleepaway camp in the Adirondacks. My parents were afraid I'd spend all my time reading and would not make friends. To prevent this, they made the rule that I could only bring one book to camp with me. The biggest book I could find was Herman Melville's Moby Dick. I loved it. Ishmael's depression cure, Captain Ahab's craziness, all the grisly details of slaughtering and butchering the whales. Strange stuff for a young girl, but I thought it was wonderful. 50 years later, I still do."
You know, it's so interesting because people today can't believe that kids were once discouraged from reading and that it was seen as like a totally antisocial, terrible thing to do, and you were not allowed.
Things have changed for the better, I think.
Yes. All right. So if other people would like to send these in, John, how do they do it?
So if readers want to send us voice memos, we'd like them to be 30 seconds long, and we'd love to hear your name, how old you were when this reading experience happened, where you were when it happened, and of course, the book that made such an impact on you. And if you need to figure out how to do a voice memo, you can visit nytimes.com/books, and we have an article there walking you through all the steps.
All right. Thanks, everyone. My colleagues Parul, Sehgal, and Greg Cowles join us now to talk about what everyone else is reading and, most importantly, what they're reading. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
So let's talk first about the bestseller list. What's new this week?
Sure. From a quote-unquote literary perspective, the two biggest books on the hardcover fiction list probably are both new. Annie Proulx's Barkskins, which is I talked about it on the podcast last week. It's very interesting, very massive. It's like 900 pages or more book about deforestation. That makes its debut at number 11 on the bestseller list. And then the other debut is up at number 3. Emma Cline's The Girls is on the list. And this is a book that got a lot of attention from the moment that it sold in a big bidding war to Random House. She's 27 years old, and this is this book set in 1969 about a group of teenage girls who get caught up in like a Charles Manson type cult. Those aren't the only new books on the list this week, but they are the most interesting.
And what's
books
on the nonfiction list?
Nonfiction, there are 2 new titles. At number 11, the Wharton School professor, Jonah Berger, has a book called Invisible Influence that is looking at kind of thought leaders, social influence, how trends move culturally, socially.
I feel like we're going to have to start like a field guide to the Jonah authors now, too, like the one that we have for the Bens and the Davids and the Jonathans.
And then at number 9, Bobby Brown, the R&B singer, has written a memoir with Nick Childs. It's called Every Little Step. He's very frank in it about his history of drug abuse and his very troubled marriage to Whitney Houston, the death of their daughter, Bobby Christina. There's an argument you can make Bobby Brown is sort of the Ted Hughes figure of the R&B world. Married to the rock star wife with self-destructive tendencies.
That's exactly what the internet is saying right now. They're making that comparison as we speak. All right. What are you reading, Greg?
I am reading Elmore Leonard. I had never read him before this year. I'd always heard great things about him. And at the very beginning of this year, my friend Charlie gave me his book City Primeval, which is it has the subtitle High Noon in Detroit. And it is very much just kind of a high noon story, the lone cowboy who takes on the bad guy. I was captivated, and I thought, wow, people are really right about Elmore Leonard. And so I've returned to him now. I'm reading Library of America has just brought out a collection of 4 later novels by Elmore Leonard, and it starts with Get Shorty, which I'd seen in the movies when it came out. It didn't do much for me as a movie.
Was it the Travolta
John
problem?
Travolta movie, yeah. I just thought, I didn't really follow it. I didn't get that into it, but I'm loving the book, so that's what I'm reading right now. It's funny because Elmore Leonard back in 2001 came out with this very famous list of his tips for writing. And number one on that list was never open a book with weather. And so I just want to read you the first couple of sentences from Get Shorty. When Chile first came to Miami Beach 12 years ago, they were having one of their off-and-on cold winters. 34 degrees the day he met Tommy Carlo for lunch at Vesuvio's on South Collins and had his leather jacket ripped off. So there you go. He started the book with weather.
I love those Library of America books. Like, I love everything about them. I even like the paper thin,
it's
pages.
like that onion skin.
Yes.
And then they come with a built-in ribbon as a bookmark.
The ribbon is key, and I love how heavy they are. They're like it's
book fetishist chat right
total
now.
book fetishist.
You feel like you're reading something from those Franklin Library,
Yes.
those leather bound.
Yeah, between that and the Modern Library, I like it. This is a serious competition between the two of them, and just in terms of that fetish quality. But yes. And Parul, what are you reading?
Speaking of weather, but this is going to make me sound like such a sap. So I grew up, in India, Southeast Asia, and around this time, especially in India, there's this feeling of suspense. You're waiting for the monsoon. And so I picked up this book last week, and I wondered why I was reading it. There's so many other things I meant to be reading, I should be reading, but it's a book called Rain, A Cultural History. Also, to be fair, I will read a cultural history of anything. If that is in the subtitle, I will read it. You're like, who will read a cultural history? I will read it, and I own it. So I'm reading A Cultural History of Rain by Cynthia Barnett, which we reviewed. I think Bill Strever reviewed it for us last year. And it's interesting. I mean, it's a sort of like wide-ranging book. She goes to the driest places in the world, wettest places in the world. She talks about the American military's efforts to use rain as a weapon to seed clouds at various points to control the weather. I mean, it's full of interesting.
What's your favorite fun fact?
Oh, the frogs. Okay, so the
frogs.
The frogs. So since Herodotus, till about I think the last sighting was 2010. People have reported seeing frogs falling from the sky,
but this is
all
true.
The time.
Yeah,
this is
sure.
true, right? Okay, you know this. I didn't know.
They get caught up in tornadoes.
Oh God,
or
let me
something?
tell you. It's my
been on the
story.
internet,
Please
Parul?
No.
Didn't you
It's all
see
about
Magnolia?
raining frogs.
I'm seeing cuddly animals on the internet. I'm not listening to frog news. But so frogs apparently fall from the sky, and people are freaked out, and nobody's been able to explain why. And apparently, yes, as Greg has already spoiled my story, these winds carry them, frogs, fish, and then deposit them miles and miles away. But it's thousands and thousands of frogs. So that's one fact that I love. I also love the fact that, in places like Manchester and places in England, every now and then they'll get red rain or red dust that coats everything. And it's actually from the Sahara. So it's full of beautiful facts like this. But I think that, doing this podcast every week is, I don't know if you guys have noticed patterns in your reading or why you pick up books, but I'm beginning to realize I really prescribe myself books for what's going on. So I was feeling this odd, kind of missing India, missing that sort of feeling of suspense, that waiting for the monsoon, waiting for the rains. And so I pick up a book about rain and sort of,
I've got a recommendation for you then.
Yeah.
This book came out, I think, about 20 years ago, but it's called Chasing the Monsoon. Do you know this book?
No, I don't.
So it's about the monsoon as it travels through India. And it starts off, he goes to the southern tip of India where they sit out basically on the southern tip of India and look out into the ocean and wait for it to come. And you can, you see it.
There's no way to describe it. The entire neighborhood comes out and waits.
Yes,
basically. And the minute the rains come, and it's just this. It's like a character. I was just talking to my husband this morning, describing the amount of songs that mention the monsoon or the rains, or as a plot device. Indian novels will frequently they'll hinge on the monsoon. Something will be building. The rains will come, and then a secret will come out.
Yeah.
So it's like a character there that it isn't quite here. Maybe snow is that way. Here, in some of Ibsen's plays, there's a storm or there's a snowstorm, and then something, some pressure is released.
It's funny because when I lived in Thailand, I was very nervous about monsoon season, and I thought, oh no, it's going to rain all day. I had no understanding of what the monsoon actually is,
just
and at
when
least
it's most inconvenient.
That's right. It would happen to me. Usually, I'd be out on my motorcycle.
On the way to the wedding,
only when you
then
step outside.
Yeah.
That's right. It's just a little daily thing that happens, and it comes and it empties out, and for one brief second, there's no humidity in the air, and then all the humidity comes back when it's over. Yes. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Parul. Thanks, Greg. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.